Go away.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the front line with Joe and Joe. Joe Pasillo, as always, joined by Joe Resinello. And once more, dear brothers and sisters, let us go into the breach on the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, 1350 on your AM dial, 103.9 on your FM dial, spreading the truth of the Catholic faith to the New York City metropolitan area. Please be sure to download the app and share it with your friends, the Veritas app. You'll have access to all of our station's content, not just the front line with Joe and Joe. And if you like what we do, we go live Thursday nights, 9 o'clock Eastern Time, across Rumble, Facebook, and YouTube. That's where we get into a whole lot of trouble. And if you like us there, please help us out again to reach a wider audience. Veritas is gracious enough to let us take these interviews and post them online. So if you like these interviews, please do the same. By all means, share them. So going into the breach, spreading the truth of the Catholic faith, I could think of several names that come to mind, in let's say recent memory when it comes to that. And Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen is one of them. And in fact, a pretty big one of them. He's had an influence on both Joe and myself. So, having said that, we're very pleased and honored to be welcomed by Cherie Hughes. And Cherie's written a new book that's out from Ignatius Press, Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, Convert Maker, because that's what he did. And we're going to get into all of that. Now, the book, like I said, is available at Ignatius Press. We would always ask you to please support our Catholic publishers as well as our Catholic authors, but also let your local Catholic bookstore at your parish or local near you tell them to order a few copies. Put it on the shelf. I promise they won't stay on the shelves too long. So Cherie holds a PhD in historical theology from Durham University in England. Her books include Catherine Drexel, The Riches to Rags Story of an American Catholic Saint, that came out in 2014, and Crossing Boundaries and Confounding Identity, Chinese Women in Literature, Art, and Film. That came out in 2023. She and her husband live in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Cherie Hughes, welcome to the front line with Joe and Joe, our sister.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here this morning.
Oh, we're glad to have you. Like I said, this is going to be a fun conversation. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Joe Resinello.
Sherry, we always begin with a prayer to Our Lady in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, never was it known that anyone who sought your help or sought your intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, we fly unto you, a virgin of virgins, our mother. To you we come, for you we stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother, the Word incarnate, despise not our petitions, but in your clemency hear and answer us. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, Sherry, there's tons to talk about. I love Fulton Sheen. I pray to him every morning, actually. One of the saints I do. I pray a prayer to him every single morning. He is an American treasure. Just a quick comment, though, on your bio, because I know a lot about Fulton Sheen. I've read a number of his books. He served in London, I believe, for a while, and you went to school there. Did you kind of hear about him when you were there? Just out of curiosity.
No, no, I did not.
Okay,
No,
just wondering because I do know that he spent some time because I know he got his I believe he got his PhD in Belgium and then
he
he
did.
went over to London. So yeah, because I was just wondering if that had some type of influence on you. But getting to him, as far as a lot of people, who is he? Some people may not know. Who is Fulton Sheen? Why was he not only a spiritual leader within the American Catholic Church, but he was a great entertainer? Tell us about him.
He is the essential man from mid-century, uh, the 1930s through the 1970s. He converted anybody and everybody. He was on the face of television. He won an Emmy Award, as you commented about being an entertainer. But mainly, he was a priest in love with the Virgin Mary, in love with the Lord, and who loved all the people. So that was his passion, helping other people. And he had a real intuitive sense of how to approach people, to know what they wanted, what they needed to come into the Catholic Church. Um, when I think it was around 2000 Y2K, he was after the Pope and after Mother Teresa, he was the most recognizable Catholic prelate in the United States. I mean, that's very recent. So he's not gone away. You say you pray to him in the morning. I think there are lots of people who are praying to him and for him so that his cause can be completed. He's on his way to being a saint.
Absolutely. Cherie Hughes is joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Please go out and buy her book, Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, Convert Maker. And the book is available at Ignatius Press. What's funny is Joe and I have mentioned several times in the time that we've been doing this show how it's amazing. He had the number one show on NBC. Am I correct about that, Cherie? Was he on NBC?
You know, I actually think it was ABC, but um, I'm not sure. But it was the number one show. I mean, there were times when he beat out "I Love Lucy," you know,
Which is saying a lot.
which is saying a whole lot, saying a whole lot. And people, he was originally opposite Milton Berle and Frank Sinatra, both of them big names in entertainment in the early 50s. So his show topped them all. It was
What's
just,
in, What's interesting is that if you think about the 1950s, and people look at the 1950s obviously as a little bit more of a conservative time in America, a little bit more of a conservative mindset, but nonetheless, it was the precursor to the disastrous 1960s. And Fulton Sheen was that popular, not only in an era that was about to go off the deep end, but also in a very Protestant America. What are your
yes.
thoughts on that? And it's not like he wore a suit and a tie. Okay, he wore the whole outfit. What are your thoughts on that? Because I think if you needed it in the 1950s, we are in desperate need of another Fulton Sheen now.
We are. And I think Robert Barron comes closest to that right now. But he uses the media a little bit differently. When Sheen was going to go on television, he asked around, what should he wear? And everybody just recommended that he wear the Roman collar and the clerical suit, black suit. And he said, well, when I go out and I give talks, I'm in my regalia. He said, I think I will do that. And I think it was very smart of him to do that. In the 1950s, probably hardly anybody had ever seen a bishop all dressed up the way he is. It was just arresting just to look at. It was all in black and white, so you couldn't see the beautiful color. But still, it also helped him to be a slightly bigger personality. I love to tell people that he was all of 5'7" and maybe 5'8" on a proud day. But I think wearing that full regalia with the ferriola, the big cape he wore over it and everything, added to his stature. And of course, they could angle the cameras up at him a little bit to make him look a little bit taller, and all the buttons down the front of his cassock, draw the line up vertically and make him look a little bit taller. But I think what he wore on the set was very important.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
Go
he
ahead, go
was
ahead.
more or less asked to go on the air, so that in the 1950s there still was a lot of anti-Catholicism. I mean, there was a fair meltdown when John Kennedy ran for president in 60. They
Hmm.
were sure that they were going to be putting the Vatican was going to move to the Mississippi Valley. I never quite understood why it was the Mississippi Valley, but I would have thought it'd been California. But at any rate, that was part of the rumor. So you shouldn't vote for him. So yes, the country was quite Protestant, even though the Catholic faith was the largest numbers numerically of any Christian group in the country, and had
Hmm.
been since the late 20s. But the culture was definitely what we used to refer to as waspish, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And the church, his marching orders from the church was to be not controversial and to try to make Catholicism um, friendly to the American audience. That he didn't really spend very much time talking about, so he didn't talk much about the Virgin Mary, except as a mother. He didn't really talk about the Pope. We didn't need to do that. He talked about things that were common to everybody, whether you're Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish. And so I think that's part of his appeal, that he was so genuine when he came on television. Um, and he was a very handsome man, very good looking, had wonderful eyes. His eyes were very arresting. Um, Somebody looked at him, somebody wrote into his positio. A positio is a document that's created for the cause of canonization. It's basically his biography and then interviews with lots and lots of people who knew him and had met him somewhere along the line and had things to say, some more than others. But one was a gentleman who had met him somewhere in, oh, I don't know, somewhere in Iowa, I believe. And he said, looking into Sheen's eyes was like looking into the eyes of God. So, I mean, I think he had that arresting effect on people.
Yeah, and also I one of the things that I've seen from, I watched the old clips and everything else, and we won't get into it now. We'll get into it in a little bit. He was pretty arresting, especially when it came to talking about communism. And obviously, you know, I would agree with you. When I listen to Fulton Sheen, I do hear a more mere Christianity, I guess, as C.S. Lewis would call it. Like he presented Christianity as an obvious Catholic, a prelate of the church,
Right.
but yet it could be appealing to anybody who calls himself a follower of Christ. Okay, and I think also what really, and again, we won't get into it now. We'll get into it later. I think his message on communism and the evil of communism also obviously very appealing to a 1950s American audience. Not for ratings, because it was true. He was pointing,
Right.
but again, we'll get into that in a little bit. Cherie Hughes is joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. We're talking about Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, Convert Maker. That's the title of her new book. It's available at Ignatius Press. Joe Resinello?
Well, let's go to the title. Who did he bring into the church?
Well, it's estimated by the person who was his postulator, that's the person who was in charge of putting forth his cause for canonization, that he had actually converted 42,000 people. I mean, that just boggles the mind, 42,000 people. And I don't know how he arrived at that number. We do know that there were many, many converts just from listening to him on the first on the radio and then later on television. He was very important personality on the radio for 20 some years. So his fame sort of predates television, but he was able to make use of both those media to bring people into the Catholic Church. So he ran convert classes for over 100 people at a time. And what he did there was he had them listen to tapes that he would develop tapes, and then he would come in and he would answer questions for them. So sometimes he would have a class of 100 in Washington, D.C., and another class of 100 up in New York City. He was back and forth to New York City, um, shuttling back and forth every week, probably more than once a week, because he had to be up there for one thing or another. So yes, I don't think we can count the people that he's actually converted. We know of some of
Any
them.
famous ones?
Oh, lots of famous ones. Not so famous today. The ones in my book were actually fairly famous at the time. I go into more detail on 8 different famous Catholic converts of his. I think probably the shining star in his firmament was probably Clare Boothe Luce. Clare Boothe Luce was an amazing woman. I really think of her as being a Renaissance woman, um, but also somebody who really struggled to get where she was going to be. She was beautiful. That helps always. She was very intelligent. Um, she married for money. She was the illegitimate child of her mother I want to think of the father as a con man, who was sometimes a violinist, but mainly a con man. So the mother went from man to man, and little Claire and her brother went along with mom, of course. So when she got to be of age, she too sort of looked for important men, wealthy men who could help her out. Um, but she eventually married Henry Luce of Time Incorporated, and together they were really the power couple in the United States. I mean, after Eleanor Roosevelt, she was the most popular woman in America during the 1950s. She had become she was an author to begin with. She started out with magazines. She was a photojournalist, started out with Vogue and going to go right out of my head. It has now. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Any rate, another really large and important, Vanity Fair. It was Vanity Fair, not Vogue, Vanity Fair. And that was a magazine in its day that had Picasso and all kinds of people, you know, doing artwork and writing for them, and she wrote for them. She also wrote screenplays and Hollywood plays. She tried novels. Every time she got into a novel, she would start tearing it up because she just couldn't get through on a novel. But she went over to Europe in the 1940s to cover the sort of the war over there. She managed to get right out of Paris, right ahead of the Nazis rolling in. She was staying at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, and the concierge said to her, "Mrs. Luce, I think you should check out now because the Germans are coming." And she said to the concierge, "How do you know?" He said, "They've made reservations." So the German high command was going to stay at the Ritz-Carlton, and she had to leave, which I sort of love that they'd made reservations. At any rate, she was very influential congresswoman, uh, and nearly everybody in her life had died except for Henry, but her daughter had died, and she was in the depths of depression, and she came upon Fulton Sheen. And we can talk about that later if you'd like, more under her. But I think she's the most famous one. There were a number of communists in that group that I've written about. Louis Boudin's was the editor of the Daily Worker, which was their main newspaper. The Communist Party of the United States was a legal party, and their main headquarters was
It still is to this day, Cherie, by the
Yes,
way, but we won't go
yeah,
there.
right. So he was a Catholic boy who started out really in Catholic causes and got into the labor movement. And so he eventually decided that the church was the better place to be, and communism was the antithesis of the church and its main blocking point. So there was also Elizabeth Bentley, who was actually a spy in a way, in the old-fashioned way, or that we think of, sitting on park benches and handing things off to other people, to strange people, wearing a flower on her jacket so they could recognize her, that sort of thing. She was the person who went from Washington to New York, carrying first documents, paper documents, and then later rolls of film of documents that her contacts in the government had smuggled out, secrets that were given to the Soviets.
Cherie, let me ask you this real quick. Let's stay there for a little bit, okay? Because we were going to talk about communism anyway, okay? Now the people I'm sure Bella Dodd is one of them also, correct?
Right.
Okay, so Bella Dodd, who by the way testified in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, that she personally, under Stalin's orders, sent over 1,000 communist agents into Catholic seminaries. Now you know better than me, Cherie. That's pretty bold. How did how did they come in contact with Fulton Sheen, or did Fulton Sheen reach out to them? And it's interesting because our view is this. Joe and I say all the time, Joe works in a bank. I work in a restaurant. Okay. We do our best. We get on this show. We try to proclaim the truths of the faith in the best way we can. And hopefully that has an effect on people. Obviously, Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen had a much larger audience. Okay, I mean, if he was on social media right now, he would be bigger than the biggest podcaster. Okay, is the reason why I asked the question is that he put it all out there. Did these people reach out to him? Let's say as they became, I guess, disillusioned with the left, disillusioned with communists, or was it the other way around? How does that happen?
Well, he becomes an anti-communist very early in his priesthood. Pope, I'm going to say Pius XI promoted him from a priest to a monsignor. And so he goes over to Rome, and the Pope says to him, "I'm very worried about communism. It is antithetical to the church. It seeks to destroy the church. I want you to become the voice speaking against communism. As long as I'm Pope, I want you to speak against communism." And so, being the scholar that he is, because he's a fabulous scholar, really one of the most intelligent people you would ever meet, he dove into communism. He dove into all their books, all their documents. He read their constitution. He read their he had a Russian. He was not Russian speaking, but he had a Russian speaking secretary who would look at Pravda, the newspaper, and tell him what's going on over there. So he really knew communism better, I think, than many of the communists that he ultimately converted. So in the case of Louis Boudin's, Louis is really out there as a journalist, also as an organizer, and Sheen is there too. And so Sheen writes an article refuting something that Boudin's had put in the newspaper, in the communist newspaper, and Sheen repudiated it point by point by point with facts and figures and quotations and what have you. And Louis thought that they should print that rebuttal in the paper so that there could be kind of a discussion going on between communism and Christianity and kind of American democracy. And the Central Committee wouldn't allow it. So Sheen actually published his own rebuttal. It's called Communism Answers the Questions of a Communist. And it's still on Internet Archives. You can find it. It's pretty interesting. And so Sheen reached out to Boudin's and said, let's have dinner. So they went to dinner together. Now Sheen, not Sheen, but Boudin's at this point had been in the party quite a long time. So they have dinner, and after dinner, Sheen basically takes all the, whatever's on the table, kind of pushes it aside. He says, now let's talk about the Virgin Mary. What? We're talking about communism, and now we're going to talk about the Virgin Mary. Well, he had done enough research, as he, would do, and he knew that Boudin's was an ex-Catholic altar boy. And actually, he might not have realized that Boudin's father had thanked the Virgin Mary for interceding for him to get a good job in a bank, Joe, in a bank that he could support his family so well. And every year on the anniversary of that, the father would take flowers to the Lady Chapel at the local cathedral and say his Thanksgiving. So he had grown up, Boudin's had sort of grown up with the idea of the Virgin Mary. But he just, like a lot of young people, was impatient. He wanted to have it all right now. And he thought that the church wasn't proactive enough. It said all the right things, but it wasn't proactive enough. And the Communist Party was. So they had this conversation about the Virgin Mary. It didn't last very long, but it shocked Boudin's and made him sort of rethink where he was. But it took him a long time. Sheen was on his way to Europe, and so he sent a letter or a postcard back to Boudin's, probably a letter, and he said, I think that there are people who are honest in their desires for a better world, for social justice, our term today, but who are really not aware of the machinations and long-term goals of the Communist Party. So he says, I count you among the people who are not really firmly in the communist camp. And so it took about 5 years for Boudin to decide, I want to become Catholic. He'd been married and then divorced his wife and had a common law marriage with another woman by whom he had eventually 4 children, but at that time he had 3. So they were not married. And she didn't want to be a Catholic. That was just not part of her. She might have had a little Unitarianism at some point, but really was not a religious person, just totally secular. And so, but she said, but I know you want to be, you have religion in you, and you would like to go to church. And she said, let's first he said, let's move out of New York City. They moved out of New York City and far out into the suburbs. That way, it would be more difficult for the party to spy on them. Evidently, everybody in the party spied on everybody else. I mean, you're just constantly looking over your shoulder. I mean, they're paranoid with a good reason because people are always following them. So when they moved to the suburbs, she said, well, let's go to the Episcopal Church. And I thought this was pretty interesting. The pastor of the Episcopal Church there in the town that they moved to, he and his wife had been brought into the Communist Party by Louis Boudin's sometimes earlier. So here we have some Episcopalians in there. So then eventually he calls up Sheen. He said, I'm ready to become Catholic, because she decided that he was so much happier when he went to the Catholic Church. And so they were converted. So, in that case, it's a kind of mutual reaching out in a way. Part of the Louis Boudin's article was, come, Sheen, won't you join us in our quest for the brotherhood of man?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Isn't that their mistake, Cherie? Is that, and I think that, like, I always thought about rank and file communists, not the leadership. Okay, I'm talking about people who actually listen to it. They want, I believe, many of them, not all of them, many of them want a better world. Let's say I think where they're mistaken and why Catholicism should be appealing. Catholicism is very realistic. You're never going to have heaven on earth. Heaven comes later. We
Right.
can make things better. We can have better conditions, okay? But if you're trying to create paradise on earth, that's where you're going off the deep end. And a lot of them, let's face it, they're true believers, but I'm not shocked when I've heard the story you just told. I had known about Bella Dodd. I'm not shocked when a high-ranking communist who is a true believer comes into the Catholic Church, because they come to the realization that this ideology, this regime. Number one, it's corrupt to the core. But number two, just practically, it doesn't work. That's my quick comment. Cherie Hughes, we got to take a quick break here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Thank you for that story, by the way. I did not know about him. I knew about Bella Dodd. I didn't know about him. And to learn more about other converts that Archbishop Fulton Sheen made, please go out and buy Cherie's book, Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, Convert Maker. Now, it is available at Ignatius Press. You can buy it from the website. You could also ask your local Catholic bookstore to buy a few copies and put it on the shelf. And I'm sure if you put it in the Google search bar, it's going to pop up, okay? But we really would like for you to support our Catholic publishers, so you could do so by buying the book from Ignatius. So Cherie Hughes is with us for another great segment on Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to the front line with Joe and Joe. Joe Pasillo and Joe Rossinello. We are way in the breach with Cherie Hughes, and we're discussing her new book, Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, Convert Maker. That's available at Ignatius Press. Please buy it from the publisher. I'll post a link to Ignatius in the description, so you could click right there, go right to the website, and please purchase her book. Fulton Sheen is somebody that everybody needs to know about. Joe Rossinello.
You mentioned, Cherie, on the other side of the break, that he was a magnetic person, that you used the example of someone who looked into his eyes. They looked into the eyes of God. I want to talk about that a little bit. If you read the lives of the saints, there's some common themes that go across them. I've read a book on the saints, gives a little blurb, and there's some saints are all different, but there's common themes. One, devotion to the Blessed Mother. That is a common theme. Two, devotion to the Eucharist. Sheen had a holy hour every day, called it his hour of power. And this is another thing that I didn't know until we did research on this book. Sheen gave all his money away that he made, $200 million. And he said something very controversial. And I think he's spot on, actually, because Mother Teresa, talking about common themes, said the same thing. And this is what he said. He said, the church needed to be poor to serve the poor. Spot on. Spot on. If you ask me, the problem in the American church versus the church in, say, Africa, we're too rich. And
Mhm.
money pulls you away from God. It's natural. Doesn't mean money is bad. You got to work harder at it. You got to work harder at it, and you got to really be focused because it's a temptation and we're people. I'm not saying the church in America is corrupt. Please don't get me wrong. What I am saying is it's an impediment and you got to work hard on it. And Sheen made tons of money. He won an Emmy and he gave it all away. And that is a common theme among saints. And that's where he drew his power. You see, he was gifted, clearly. Smart guy. I know I'm ranting. I'm going to turn it over to you, but I'm an Italian guy. I got to rant. I can't help myself. He was
I
gifted.
feel like the show was missing something if we didn't get a Joe Resinello
That's
rant.
a given.
But then again, I do the
I mean,
same thing, so I'm not going to say anything.
he's
No,
gifted
we want
guy.
it.
He's smart, clearly. But there's tons of smart people in this world. That's not what draws people in. That's the mistake of smart people. They're too confident in their smarts. See, I don't have that problem. So I know that. You got to rely on God. And he emptied himself of the things that got in the way of God, and he filled himself with the Holy Spirit. There is the winning formula. There is the secret to his success. I'm turning it over to you. Tell me what you think.
Well, I I couldn't have said better what you just said, honestly. Um, from his earliest time, when he was 4 days old, his mother put him on the altar of Our Lady's altar right after he had been baptized by the priest and dedicated him to her and under her protection. So he had just a huge, huge devotion to the Virgin Mary. She was not a saint that was just out there somewhere. She was his mother, his second mother. So yes, that devotion to the Virgin Mary was keen. He even wanted to die on one of her feast days. He asked that. Um, it's one of the reasons he went to Lourdes over 30 times in Paris or in France to be close to the Virgin Mary there. Um, it was totally his kenotic self. And kenosis means self-emptying or emptying. It's the word that they use in Philippians when it says Jesus Christ emptied himself and took on the form of a slave. And this is what Sheen does. This is what saints do. They empty themselves. They don't need the money. They don't have the money for themselves. He was very ascetic. He hardly ate anything. As a young man, he had stomach problems, but he just didn't eat. It wasn't something that was wonderful for him, though he loved chocolate and candies. But for the most part, he ate very little. Um, he prayed constantly. This holy hour, as you say, the hour of power, gave him what he needed to get through the other 18 hours of a day. I mean, he typically worked a 19-hour day. I mean, he did more in a 24-hour period than most of us do in a week or more, just because he was so focused. And his efforts did not get diminished. I was saying, I think earlier before the break, that he was on radio and television together for a year. So he's going crazy doing all these things, but he has the energy. It's not like he's certainly now only giving half of himself to television and half of himself to radio. No, he gave himself all in every aspect of it. I think part of that saying about the church needs to serve the needs of the poor, lest it become the poor church. And I think in that second half of that statement, it doesn't mean that the church will be without money. It'll mean that it will be uh, the same way you say, oh, poor Harry, he fell down and broke his leg. I mean, it just wouldn't be functioning at the way it should be functioning. It doesn't mean that it's monetarily poor, because obviously it needs a lot of money. Um, and Sheen, under his guidance, that we were paying more than 75% of all the world missions coming from the United States Catholics under his tutelage, if you will. He was the American director for the Society for the Propagation of the Faith, which was the arm of the church that maintains its foreign missions.
Mhm.
I live down here in Oklahoma. Do you know we're still in mission territory? Which I
Is
found
that right?
Yeah, that was sort of interesting. But no, he gave away his money. He didn't keep receipts. Good Lord, if the IRS ever really wanted to audit the man, it would have been impossible because he was not tuned, like can we say, tuned into money. It didn't motivate him. Um, his nephew gives a statement or saying about how he walked through a hotel lobby and people just came up and stuffed money into his pockets. And then he goes out on the street and gives it away to the first beggar who sees him. He
Right.
just, it was income outgo. It just wasn't for him. So very physically, he doesn't eat a lot. He even wore a hair shirt at one point. And I think all this is to keep himself from being too proud. Um,
Yeah,
one,
that's what I see. That's what I see in Fulton Sheen is that is a humble man, somebody who didn't let it go to his head. Okay, like
no,
that's the way. Again, I didn't know Fulton Sheen. I wasn't alive or I was a little boy when he died. But that's what strikes me about him. And then when I
yeah,
hear your story about that, Cherie Hughes joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe, I'm like, yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. They stuff a few $100s in his pocket walking down the street, and he goes and gives it to the nearest guy who needs a hot meal. I'll be honest with you. I wish I had that disposition. So many of us, and don't get me wrong, we need money, we have responsibilities. Joe's got a family, I got a family. I get that. It's the trappings of money is
right,
what both as a Catholic Church in America, as individual Catholics, that we always have to be on guard for that.
right.
Always. Let's move it forward. Cherie Hughes joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, Convert Maker. It's available at Ignatius Press. I'll post a link to Ignatius so you can go and buy the book from the publisher. We'd really like for you to do so. So Second Vatican Council. Okay, I mean to this day, it's a topic. I mean, and Catholics shouldn't shy away from talking about Vatican II. All right, there are some over here, there are some over here, there are some a little bit more sober about it. Okay, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about Vatican II, and we're still discussing it in 2025. Okay, and that was what 60 years ago. What was Bishop Fulton J. Sheen's participation at the Second Vatican Council?
He probably was the most active of the American bishops who were there. He also was probably the only one of the American bishops who was actually fluent in Latin. All the talks there were given in Latin. So he was able to participate. He was there certainly as part of the missions. One of the things I thought was very interesting for him, there's two things I'd like to talk about. One
Please.
is one is how he was opposed to the idea of mission territory. He thought mission should be wherever the need is. He didn't like it being geographical, that Oklahoma would be mission territory. Um, is there a need in Oklahoma for, more money for the church? Actually, the church does, I think, very well here in Oklahoma. It's a very small percentage of the population, probably less than 3%, but it's also very, very forward socially, politically, economically. Um, when Sheen went with Spellman on a trip to Asia, it was a 52-day trip. That's a long time to be packed out of a suitcase. He he saw real poverty that doesn't really exist in the U.S. Even during the depth of the Depression, he said that the people in America were better fed, better dressed, better housed. Um, than most of the people he found over there. So that actually shook him up a little bit uh, to see that kind of poverty. So it began his mind thinking about poverty. Um, and he wanted the church to sort of do away with geographic lines and go to wherever the need is. Call it whatever you want, but the need is there. Um, the bishop from Krakow, who becomes John Paul II, was at the Vatican Council. And he said to Sheen, and at the time in 62, they're still under, Soviet rule, pretty much. Um, I need seminaries. I need money for, to make new priests. That's what I need. And so he wanted to give John Paul II, at that time, Karol Wojtyła, the money, thought it should come from there. He was so taken with the bishops from needy dioceses around the country, especially in the Asia and Africa, that he actually paid for their hotel rooms in Rome during the Vatican Council. And he not only paid them, he lived there with them, which I thought was amazing. And evidently, Karol Wojtyła learned, or perfected perhaps, his English from listening to Bishop Sheen tapes, which I thought was amazing.
That is Cherie Hughes joining us here at the Frontline with Joe and Joe. Joe Rossinello, where do you want to go?
Secularism. I've listened to his show. He would always talk about secularism, just as he talked about communism. And I think today people are too quick to just say it's harmless. Secularism is not harmless. It's not harmless. There's a lot of danger that goes along with that. To be truthful with you, a lot of times people who are very secular have blinding, like they have cataracts on their eyes. They don't see properly. You hear that even very, very intelligent people, what they basically, you know, follow, what they believe in. They're led, as Bob Dylan once said, if you're going to serve somebody, if it's not the Lord, you're going to serve somebody else. Talk about what he had to say about secularism.
He likened secularism to barnacles on a ship. He said, you have to scrape them off and get rid of them. Ultimately, they'll destroy the ship. And he saw barnacles in the United States through the secularism that leads, he thought, inevitably to communism. Once you take God out of the public square, which secularists do, they reduce religion. It used to be sort of just reducing it to a personal feeling. But now you can't even have personal feelings. You get arrested outside of a abortion clinic. If you're out there praying quietly, you're likely to get arrested. So no longer, are you safe? So secularism is, I think it's an easier word for people to say, I'm secular, than to say I'm religious. But, if you look at communism, it's a kind of religion. It's gods, it's got Marx and Lenin and Engels and Stalin and everybody else. It's got its sacred books. It's got its holy days, May 1st every day. It has its ideas of human flourishing, which is just the opposite of what Christianity would say. He and the bishops of the United States put out a document condemning secularism as just kind of a way station to communism. I think to be called a secularist, well, nobody calls him a secularist.
Mm-hmm.
They'll say, we are secular, but I don't think they even think of themselves as being anti-religion. But Joe, you comment about, the blinders on their eyes, they just can't see. I mean, it's shocking when you hear some of these people, the philosopher from, I think it might have been Princeton, who thought that you should have, I don't know, sometime after the birth of a baby to decide whether you want to abort it or not, which is really
Peter
Sanger, Peter Sanger,
yeah, yeah.
Peter Sanger,
Which amazes me that he sits as a university professor at the same university as Professor Robert George.
right.
Like when you made statements like you make, I'll throw one out to you so you can continue, Cherie. Secularism also leads to, or when you take God out of the equation, okay, and you need to fill that hole because there's going to be an awfully big one there. Also, not only leads to communism, also leads to some of the unfettered or frenetic capitalism we see. People don't remember they're both materialist worldviews. Now, I'm obviously a free marketeer. I'm an American. I believe in markets and that they're good. Okay, they could be abused just as much as big markets could be abused just as much as big government. In the case of communism, total government. At the end of the day, though, the thing they have in common is they are both lacking God. You're looking to something else in the material world to take the place of the where you ousted God from. Do you know where I'm going with that, Cher?
Actually, I just want to just piggyback on both of you just said. They condemn secularism. The church condemned it. Pius X, another Joe, Giuseppe Sardo, that's three Joes, just for the record, for you people out there. He condemned modernism. I don't think we're clear enough. Now, it's a different approach. I get it. I get it. Everyone has different approaches. We're trying to basically, like thinking like we're going to walk with the secularist. If you don't know that something is bad, it's almost like, to be honest with you, you have to draw the line. The church, if you ask me, not like a savage, not like a lunatic, not to beat people over the head, but to condemn secularism is a correct view, because here is an inconvenient truth. Secularism doesn't lead to heaven.
No.
You don't just float into heaven. So, one, if you care for somebody and the church cares for everybody, I have to draw that line. And I have to be very clear. You are treading in dangerous water. That's my job, because I love you. I have children. I have 5 kids. If my children tread in dangerous water, I will tell them, you are in danger. Your thoughts? I'm crazy. Yes. Your thoughts?
Well, I would agree with you everywhere down that line, and I think Sheen would as well. The communists say they want the brotherhood of man, but without the fatherhood of God. So if you have the brotherhood of man without the fatherhood of God,
Cherie, can I ask you a question?
sure.
This is what I mean about the world, that they complicate things. Jesus gave us the means by which we achieve the brotherhood of man. Love God first and love your neighbor as yourself.
Sure.
See, people like to pay lip service to that. Do you love your neighbor as yourself? Because if you did, both as individuals and as societies and as nations, if we took that Christian principle to heart and actually implemented us in the way we do things as human beings, guess what you get? You really won't get much more, because you have to treat your brother as you would yourself. You won't get much theft as you do, let's say, with communists, okay, because they steal everything, all right? Because you treat your fellow man as you know where I'm going with that. But see, the Catholic Church has the answer to everything. I know that cheeses off a lot of people. I really don't care. I'm with Joe Rossinello when it comes to this, all right? I don't care. The Catholic Church has a stranglehold on the truth. Because we possess the fullness of the truth. Go ahead, Cherie.
Well, count me in with you and Joe on that one for sure. One of the priests that Louis Boudin's talked to before no, it wasn't Louis Boudin's. I'm sorry, it was Hayward Brune. Talked to before he converted to Catholicism. He talked to a priest who was telling him that if you really knew what the Catholic Church, if we did what the Catholic Church said and we followed the dictates of Jesus, it would be far more revolutionary than anything the communists could dig up.
Oh, I would agree with that completely. I mean, if you
Yep.
look at saints, saints are not just like namby-pamby people. I mean, you look at Mother Teresa. She shook the foundations of the world, in plain English. That's a modern saint. I mean, like, we all saw that with our own eyes. Jesus Christ was a revolutionary. There is no greater revolutionary that ever walked the earth than Jesus Christ. People have this misconception of what the church is. And Sheen used to say that. To quote him, he said, People believe what they think the church teaches as opposed to what it really does teach.
Right.
And if they knew that, they wouldn't despise the church. They wouldn't hate the church. That's the lie of the devil. And he was a revolutionary in many ways, to be truthful with you. An amazing human being.
Yes, just I agree. He was totally amazing, and it's because he loved people. The kind of the corruption we're talking about here is an anthropology that does not meet the anthropology of the church. The church sees, and God, made us this way in the likeness and image of God. So we have this inherent dignity. And when you get into communism and some other areas, and maybe unfettered capitalism, you view people as objects, not as ends in themselves. And they're there as long as they serve the state, and after that, they have no reason for being.
Well, that's why I think Cherie Bishop Fulton Sheen was so important. We're coming up in the next few minutes towards the end, but that's
Yeah.
why to me it's so important. Not just what he did at his time, but the influence that he's had. Now we know that Bishop Barron is influenced by Fulton Sheen. I believe he said that on numerous occasions. Okay, one of Joe, my heroes, Father Karapi, helped to bring me back to practicing the faith after quite some time. And but Father Karapi used to talk about Fulton Sheen all the time. Yeah, I never heard. I had heard when I was a kid of Fulton Sheen. Didn't know who he was. Started watching Father Karapi, and after that, started listening to Fulton Sheen and reading Fulton Sheen and understanding what he was all about. It's so important, and this is where I'm going to throw it over to you, Cherie, is that we continue that legacy of no matter what, don't sit on your hands. Don't think people are just going to get it. Okay. We have to open our mouths boldly, as Joe said, draw the line and say, this is what the Catholic Church believes, and we all need to accept the fullness of the truth in the Catholic Church. And say it. Say it wherever you are, whether you're on a podcast, whether you're at a men's mission, whatever the case might be. We have to proclaim the truth of the Catholic faith boldly. That's what Fulton Sheen did. So that's my long-winded way of asking, what do you think is going to be his primary legacy? I think it's because of his influence on others who are now out there doing the same thing. What are your thoughts?
Well, certainly Bishop Barron owes him much. I was listening to Bishop Barron one time, and he said, well, he did not, begin doing the holy hour. It was sort of the next generation of young priests after Barron had been out for, I don't know, maybe a decade, maybe not that long, who had adopted the holy hour, that they had been the ones who were influenced, and then that they influenced him. So you are right about that. Bishop Sheen and Dorothy Day were the only two Americans that he did a profile of in his pivotal people, I think it was. At any rate,
Mm-hmm.
he's very, very keen on that. My takeaway from this is that we shouldn't sit on our hands, as you were saying. If you were sitting next to Bishop Sheen on an airplane, by the end of the flight, you'd be Catholic. And that happened, more than once. He's got the stewardess that he met coming back, and he talked to her. And a couple of months later, she shows up at his office saying, I'm going to become, I'm leaving airlines. I'm going to become a nun and a missionary in Asia. I mean, he just had that kind of influence on people in a very short period, a plane ride, for gosh sakes, even though it was across the Pacific Ocean, still a long trade ride. So I think we are shy about professing our faith, shy about asking others to join us. And I think if we can get over some of that shyness, we may bring more people in. And also his exuberance. He was a very happy person, very exuberant person, very positive person. And I think that's something that's incumbent upon us. We can't be just sort of, mumbling our beads here, saying 10 rosaries a day. As good as rosaries are, you really need to get out there and talk to people. I'm not sure that sets us up necessarily for, standing on street corners, but some people do that.
Well, listen, his hour of power seems to work. Okay, and yeah, that's my view. Like if we miss the rosary, my wife and I, and on a particular day, I don't feel right. I feel like I'm missing something. I quite frankly do. You have to have that time with God. You're not doing anything without Christ.
Right.
Okay. Again, getting back to like say we were talking about trying to do things without God. Try to do things without God. Go look at human history and see how that turned out. Doesn't work out that well. Cherie Hughes, it's been a wonderful, wonderful time talking with you about Bishop Fulton Sheen. So to let our audience know then everywhere they could buy the book.
Um, You can get it online from the publisher, other online sales, and also in your local Catholic book and gift store. So yes, support the Catholic press and the Catholic bookstores.
Absolutely. I always tell the story. If I didn't mention to tell the Catholic bookstores to stock some, Father Fessio would get mad at Joe and I. So we don't want Father Fessio mad at us. We love him
No,
too much.
no,
He's another fantastic guy. We'll talk about him another time. But God bless Father Fessio and everything that Ignatius Press is doing. There's a lot of great material at Ignatius Press, so I would encourage you to click the link in the description and go browse their titles. But that's after you buy Cherie's book, Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, Convert Maker. Cherie Hughes, you're welcome back here at the front line with Joe and Joe anytime. Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. I loved every minute of it. God,
Thank you.
God love you.
God love you. And thank you all out there for joining us at the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, 1350 on your AM dial, 103.9 on your FM dial, spreading the truth of the Catholic faith to the New York City metropolitan area. Download the app, share it with your friends. You'll have access to all of our station's content. And wherever you see Joe and I on social media, please like, subscribe, share, do all that fun stuff and help us out. And remember, until the next time, that our conversation is your conversation, and that conversation is going on everywhere. We'll talk to you soon.